Hi, I'm Shane and welcome back to Relative Time. Now, a few weeks ago I took a short trip to Arizona, and whenever I go on a trip I try to take a watch with me that I need to review, just so I can spend some time with it and really solidify my thoughts about it. Yet for this trip I was having kind of a hard time deciding, because I'm not really sure what goes with the desert. But ultimately I decided to bring the Orient Triton with me, which is a watch I've had for months now and I've really been meaning to do a review about it. And it might seem a little odd to take a dive watch to the desert, but I think it just goes to show you that that's really what a good tool watch is for, that you can take it pretty much anywhere. Now the Triton is one of, if not the best affordable diver that Orient makes, and many people do refer to it as a mini OSD, which was the Orient saturation diver, and I think it's now discontinued, but it really was a beast of a watch with, well, a price tag to match. But what makes the Triton great is that not only does it look like a smaller version of the OSD, but it actually uses the exact same movement with the power reserve indicator for a fraction of the price. Not to mention that it's also fairly capable on its own, as it has a diver's 200-meter water resistance rating and a sapphire crystal. Now, there's one quick thing I want to mention before we really dive into the Triton. And I noticed this as I was putting the review together, but a lot of the dealers are now referring to this as the Orient Neptune, not the Triton. So at some point recently, there was evidently a rebranding effort on this. But whether you call it a Triton, or a Neptune, or even a mini saturation diver, it's still the exact same watch. And it is a heck of a watch. And even though it might be smaller than the saturation diver, it is still a little on the large side. And that's because it has a width of 43.4 millimeters, and that's without the crown. With it's closer to 45. So it's going to be a touch larger than some of Orient's other divers, as well as say a Seiko SKX, yet still smaller than some of Seiko's other popular divers. Lug to lug here is also a little larger at 51 millimeters, and while I usually think that's a little too long, for some reason here it didn't really bother me. Perhaps because there's a slight curve to the lugs as they go out, maybe just giving it a slightly tighter fit. The Triton is also just a little tall. Now Orient lists this as 13.6 millimeters thick, and it sort of is. At least if you don't count the embossed logo on the case back, which does stick out a little. With that, it's more like 14.2. Otherwise, the Triton uses standard 22mm lugs and has a really good solid weight at 200 grams, and that's with the bracelet. Now, I do want to point out that the water resistance is a diver's rated 200 meters, so it is definitely built to a bit of a higher spec than some of Orient's other divers. Now, price we will come back to at the end as usual, but I'll mention that it does range from about $300 all the way up to $500. It really just depends on where you're looking and what sales happen to be going on. In many ways, the case of the Triton just kind of reminds me of an extra large version of an SKX or the new 5KXs, yet with thinner but longer lugs sticking out, as well as it has this extra large crown at the 4 o'clock position, rather than say the 345 on a Seiko. Like most divers these days, it does have a brushed finish on top, as well as a polished finish on the sides, as well as a beveled polish edge that just sits in between the two, just acting as a border and helping to highlight the overall case shape. And as you look at the side profile, you will notice some drilled lugs, which is always a nice sight. And I think the only other Orient diver that has drilled lugs might be the Orient USA model. Overall, the finishing is good, and everything is nicely done. I couldn't really find any rough or sharp edges on the thing. And that does include the case back with that nicely embossed logo. And on the back it does point out that the Triton is also made in Japan. The signed crown is at the 4, and I really like how they signed it here. And the crown as a whole is just a little bit larger, but not too much, and only protrudes from the crown guards just enough to get a good grip on it. Although visually I do think it looks a little bigger than it actually is, and that's partially because there's a notch cut out in the middle with an O-ring sitting in it. And that O-ring is more for just a bit of visual flair, as it doesn't actually stick out beyond the metal, so it doesn't really help you with the grip any. At least not compared to the knurling on the crown itself. The crystal here is a flat sapphire with AR coating, and really it's what you'd expect at this price, at least if you're not Seiko. And if you do look at the side, you can see that the bezel insert sticks up just a hair above the crystal. So if you do lay it down flat, the bezel will hit the surface first, but not by much. And speaking of the bezel, it's also pretty much what you expect. It's 120 click, unidirectional, and has a blue aluminum insert. Now, for the price, ceramic here would be nice, but I think aluminum is perfectly acceptable. Now, in terms of the action in getting a grip, and comparing it to a lot of the watches I've seen recently, the Triton's bezel is just really easy to get a hold of and rotate. It sticks out just slightly beyond the case, and the edge does have enough grip without being too sharp or awkward to grab. There is a little bit of a backplay, and the audible click is maybe a little tinny and hollow sounding, at least for my taste compared to some of the micro brands I've had. But overall it's not bad, and I do think it's better than my Turtle. More importantly, however, is that the bezel and the chapter ring are aligned with the dial. But let's move on to the dial, which I think really brings the whole package together, and I think it combines to just create one of the best tool watches I've run across. And in many ways, it's a stark contrast to the Mako and the Kamasus from Orient. With those, there was just a sense of elegance, or maybe exotic elegance with the Kamasu, which I think comes from their sharper, more poignant indices, as much as the vibrant and just more colorful reflection of the dial with the light. While the Triton seems to have more of a tool-like, or maybe business-first sense to it. While there still is a subtle sunburst effect, the dial is definitely toned down a bit, and almost looks like a matte finish when you have a brighter light shining directly on it. And this tool-like design I think even extends to the brushed finishing on the hands compared to the polish on the others. Yet the Triton isn't completely devoid of any refining touches. The applied indices have a thick, very polished metallic border, which no matter the angle you turn it at, they always just seem to catch the light, and they offer this just really stark contrast against the dark blue background, which I think translates into making a very easy to read watch in most conditions. The hands and the indices just always seem to stand out, which I think is also added by just a slight green hue from the Lume on those indices, but more on that later. The overall dial layout also just really reminds me of an SKX, dots with wedges that are sloping towards the center, which seem to form almost a crosshair effect that draws your eyes in. And that also seems to distract just slightly from a small but unobtrusive date window at the fore. That date window does impact one of the indices, but just a little, and I can tell you from first-hand experiences, I actually even forgot it had a date a few times. For a change, the Orient logo isn't applied, or even at the top. Like the dial, it seems to be toned down a bit and just printed above the 6, along with the typical text. Which the major reason for this is at the top you do have a power reserve meter, which is a very slightly sunken subdial. That power reserve indicator is kind of a commonplace on a lot of the Orient star line, but it's much less common outside of it, and this is one of the few examples. Which I think also gives the Triton a very unique feature for this price range. I can't really think of another diver near this price with a power reserve meter. And I do appreciate the red pop on the hand there. I think it just gives the Triton just a little bit more color. In fact, I'd actually prefer it if the second hand was red rather than the white. But maybe that's just my personal preference. The design overall might look just a tad crowded, but that may be the price you pay for that power reserve indicator. Otherwise, I think it's a great design that just seems to be more focused on functionality than maybe looking flashy. And in some ways, I kind of almost feel that this is more of an evolution of, say, the SKX design than, say, Orient's RA or Mako line. And my only real gripe here is maybe that the hour and minute hand are just a tad bit shorter than I think they should. So let's talk about Lume. And Lume on the Triton isn't just good, it's fantastic. And I don't know if Orient finally decided to break into Seiko and steal a bunch of their Lumebrite and just put it all on the Tritons, but whatever they're doing, it's definitely working. And it's definitely an improvement over the Mako and RAs. Now, this is a point I really want to stress, as usually when I run into this level of Lume, it's on a micro brand. And there they're doing it kind of in a sense of overkill just to really impress the enthusiasts out there. Say like the Swiss watch company's Diver, which has 20 layers of Swiss Super Luminova. And in fact, the Triton actually kind of reminds me of that watch, as the indicators here, just like there, are always glowing just a little bit green. And that's something I definitely noticed when I was out in Arizona with that really intense sun and just kind of coming in and outdoors. Now, I ran a couple of comparison tests here, and initially I was really just curious how it compared to, say, a turtle and the Orient Kamasu. And as you can see, it's definitely better than the turtle and maybe just a little bit better than the Kamasu. But I wanted to take it up a notch and directly compare it to the Great Wall. So I set up a 5-hour time lapse and let it go. Now it does take a while, but eventually the Great Wall does come out on top. But as you can see, the Triton, well, it definitely gives it a run for its money. So again, it's just really fantastic lume. And if I had happened to do this review a month or two ago, then this watch would have definitely been on that Lumeween Halloween special I did. Movement-wise, we have Orient's in-house 40N5A movement, and it's pretty much just like their standard movement. It's a standard beat rate, 40-hour power reserve, packing, and hand winding. But what gives it something special is again that power reserve indicator. And I can say from first-hand experience that if you're on a trip with a couple different watches, having one with that power reserve meter really does come in handy. It's not a necessity in any way, but really nice to have. Accuracy here has been pretty good. I think it's only been gaining about 9 seconds a day. But again, that's always luck of the draw. And as for the bracelet, well, it's pretty much just like every other Seiko and Orient I've run across so far. Usually they're decent, maybe even good for the price. Yet they're not really what I'd call great, and oftentimes I just wind up swapping them out for something with more comfort. And here, I actually really like the Triton on a silicone strap. But the bracelet it does come with does have solid end links, and the finishing is pretty good. It's brushed on top to match the case, and polished on the edges to stand out. The clasp is good, but it is just stamped. And I want to say that it's the exact same one I've seen on not just other Orients, but even other Seikos like my Turtle and the 5KX. So again, I think it's good, but I wouldn't necessarily call it great or even memorable. And I do think that is one really valid complaint against the Triton here, at least with its MSRP. It should have a better bracelet than one that's only really mildly better than what you'd get on a Mako or say a Ray for half the cost. However, on that bracelet, the Triton actually wears surprisingly well, at least for its slightly larger size. The longer lugs have a slight curve to them, so even though the lugs do look like they're starting to overhang my wrist, I think that curvature just helps the watch kind of contour to the wrist, and kind of makes it feel like it just belongs there. It does feel larger than your typical 42mm, but not really much larger, which I think is partially because the case does seem to taper rather quickly as you go out to the edges, and having that crown at the 4 instead of the 3 does help as well. Now, in the previous month, I spent a lot of time with the Seiko 5KX in preparing for its review. But I haven't worn it much since then, and I've actually spent most of the time wearing an NTH Takuna. Yet as soon as I put the Triton on, it immediately reminded me of how the 5KX feels, but maybe a little bit larger. So if you have any experience with an SKX or the new 5KXs, I think that should give you a good idea of what the Triton feels like to wear. Overall, I think the Triton is a great watch, and probably the best diver that Orient still makes, at least outside the Orient Star line. And I think it's also a compelling option for Seiko fans, and maybe specifically SKX fans, who might want an upgrade, or maybe something just a little more right outside the gate. Although the Triton also solidifies Orient's legacy of really giving watch geeks and enthusiasts exactly what they want, rather than say some other companies that are more telling them what they want and hoping they listen. Yet as compelling a watch as the Triton is, I actually still prefer the Orient Kamasu, and even after almost a year, it's still one of my favorite watches. I actually prefer it because it's just a little bit smaller, as well as a little bit thinner, so it's a bit more comfortable to wear throughout the day. Not to mention the price is a little bit more appealing. Kamasu prices can vary, but I've actually been seeing them regularly under $200 on the gray market. And that right there is just a hell of a lot of watch for the money. However, the Triton is still a good watch for the price, especially if you happen to find it on sale closer to $300. And at that price, it even beats out some of the great micro-brand divers out there. However, the trick is actually finding it on sale. And when you do find it on sale, they do tend to sell out rather quickly, especially the blue version. I've seen it happen multiple times on Orient USA's site. But if you're interested, then just keep hunting and looking. It's definitely a watch that's worth it. But let me know what you think about the Orient Triton down below, as well as if there are any watches in the Orient star line you have an interest in. I think that might be my next Orient. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.